In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta that includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney First Nations. Also, the Métis region, Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So we're very appreciative that both Doug Richards and Erik Butters are here today to share some of their memories and stories with us. I think it's going to be really rich and interesting. Doug Richards was born and raised on the ranch that his father and mother, Jim and Tilly, started in the 1930s. He's a horse rancher and raises rodeo stock at the Devil's Head Ranch with wife Jill. Sons Jimmy and Billy are also involved in the rodeo stock business. Erik Butters is a third-generation cattle rancher raised on the ranch. His two daughters and their husbands, Aaron and John, Liz and Jake, are involved in ranch business. Brother Lamont, our sound system man, also lives on the ranch and helps out as he can. So this afternoon's presentation will begin with Doug Richards, after which and then Erik, and then we'll have a 20-minute coffee break that could take longer. But then we will resume again and enjoy. I'll turn it over to Doug.
Thank you, Penny. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Glad to see you all here. I hope you are going to enjoy Beaupre's first annual 2 hours of torture. I was wondering maybe if I could get Carol to lock the door, because I've always had the urge to play before a captive audience. Before I get started, I would like to say I'm taking the fifth, because I'm going kind of somewhat of read, somewhat of heard, and somewhat of experienced, and I might not have all the dates and that correct, but it is what it is. So I guess I'm finished. Are you ready, Erik? I suppose I should start a little bit about telling where I came from, other than down the Forestry Road and left on Beaupre Creek Road. But my grandfather, well, one of my great uncles actually came out to the Morley district in 1902 and bought a half interest in a sawmill that was over on Bear Hill Road, which is east of Morley and south of the Trans-Canada. In 1903, my grandfather came out and bought the other half interest in the mill, and they then moved it to the north side of Morley on the side of a little lake northwest of the McDougall Church, and not too far from where the Hudson Bay Post and the original Dave McDougall had a trading post, and they were just to the west there. And they started the sawmill there, and they operated the sawmill till about 1920, and it burnt down in 1920, but they stayed there another 9 years, till 29, cutting props and telephone poles and whatever. And in 1935, my dad homesteaded the place where I live now, and my sister and I we were born in Calgary, but we were raised there, and I'm still on the place, never saved enough money to leave. And I was reminded one time, I was talking with a friend of mine here a while ago, and he said when his grandfather came to this country, he was really glad that his grandfather had a good enough horse that he got as far as the Cochrane district before it played out. You know, my grandfather must have had too good a horse, because he went one day's ride too far west. But it is what it is. And as a kid growing up, I never went to school, took correspondence, and till about grade 9, and by that time I was bigger than my mother, so that's when I quit school. And I think I was about 15. I went to work for Dalton Gibson in his sawmill up on Jameson Road, and I worked there for 2 or 3 winters. They were like a second family to me, and it was one of the best jobs I ever had. I had room and board, good people, and I made $1 an hour, and I didn't have a vehicle and nowhere to spend it if I had someplace to go anyway. And I don't think I've been as rich since. However, as far as some of the history of the Ghost River area goes, way back just after the kind of the turn of the century, Eau Claire Lumber had a logging camp up about where Meadow Creek and Johnson Creek run into the Waipress. And they logged up there for quite a few years. And their first road, they kind of went up here and took what's called the Tote Road and went on the north side of the Waipress village and up to their camp. Well, it wasn't long till they built a road south down through our place and through the reserve to Morley, because in those days everything had to go and come on the train, so it was the easiest place to get supplies and that. And that's how come the road first originated into our part of the world. And when they had the camp up there, they had 2 or 3, I'm not sure how many, but they had several small dams on the Waipress Creek. And they would log and haul the logs out onto the creek. And then in the spring when it melted, they would let the water out of one dam and float the logs as far as they would go, and then they would close another dam. And they keep doing this until you got enough water, and they floated the logs down Waipress, and then they got to the Ghost River, and from there they floated them into Calgary, where they had their sawmill down where it's, I guess it's Eau Claire Square, whatever they call it now, down in that area. And they did that till, I don't know how long they logged up on Waipress, but they did float logs down the river to Calgary till they built the Ghost Dam, and which was about 29. And then they established the mill on the south bank of the Ghost where they park all the boats now. And it was there, and it operated until sometime in the early 50s. I don't think they floated in my time. I don't remember them floating any logs down the Waipress. They used to float them down the bow from the Kananaskis, and then they would process them there at the mill. And so that's kind of how the road got into the country where we live now. And at that time, there wasn't too many people really lived in the area. The Bar C Ranch was in existence, which Erik will tell you about here in a bit. And Dawson's and Harris's and us lived on the south side of the Ghost, and that was about it. And when we went to town, well, we didn't hobnob much with the people on the north side of the river, because Eau Claire had 2 little log bridges spanning the Ghost, because there was 2 channels, and it was just below where the bridge is now. And one of them washed out before I remember, and the other one got partially washed out and was sat at a bit at an angle. So you had to go across the first little bridge and then ford the other stream. So in those days with 2-wheel drive cars, it was pretty easy to get stuck. And besides, at that time, if everything was in good shape and all the gates were closed, there was, if my memory serves me correct, 26 gates from our place to the 1A highway. So we went out the south way. It was probably just as good a road, and there was only 3 gates. So as times have changed a little bit. And on things like that, but like I said, we didn't go to school, and don't think I missed a hell of a lot. But as I don't know, do you want to tell about the Bar C Ranch now? Because I guess this is kind of on the history of the place and not about us guys. Well, here, I'll think of something else. Okay.
Thank you very much, Doug. And I'm trying to grapple with the distance to keep this microphone. You have to keep it pretty close or you can't hear. But Doug suggested if I keep it too close, I'll be addicted to Copenhagen before the day's done. Talking about the Barcy Ranch, the history of the Barcy Ranch, I'll just start with the Le Sueurs. Le Sueur is actually a Belgian name, I believe, L-E-S-U-E-U-R, but they pronounce it as if there was a W in it, so it's called Le Sueur Creek. And the Le Sueurs were from the Isle of Guernsey before they came here and had been in the coffee business before coming to Canada. Arthur William Payne Le Sueur filed on Northwest Quarter 4, 27.7 west of the 5th, which is where the Barcy home buildings are right now. But he built west of there beside a good spring. He later moved the buildings to the land that he had homesteaded and for which he received patent on December 3rd, 1908. This quarter section became the home place of the Barcy Ranch. George Creighton came west from Ontario, where he had worked on the Ottawa River log drives. An excerpt from Frank White's diary, May 29, 1883, closed with Louis Beaupre for his farm and improvements for $1,000 and cattle at $35 per head. George, of course, Beaupre is what this community and hall are named for in Beaupre Creek. This location then became the first headquarters of what became the Barcy. And Creighton had a house built on this part of the ranch at the time. Lived in it for a few years with his wife, who so sadly died in childbirth when they were here, and was buried, baby and mother, beside the buildings. They were later exhumed and moved to the cemetery in Cochrane. Creighton's big ambition was to own 1,000 head of horses. And with that in mind, he bought the Le Sueur property, and it became known as the Barcy, of course, Creighton's initial in the brand. The Forestry Department and the Forest Service, as I understand it, was still a Dominion Forest Service until about 1930, when the control and management of the forest was turned over to the provincial government. But that department sent a man named Flack into Creighton's lease and to build a log ranger station. He built it, it was a log cabin, but it was going to be called the ranger station. Creighton burnt it down, and he said that he was obligated to burn it down because the terms of his lease, and frankly the terms of the grazing lease today, say that the leasee is not allowed to cut green timber nor allow anyone else to. So he felt he had to burn them down. So the next year, the Forestry Department hired a guy called Archie Howard to build another log cabin, and told him to watch out for Creighton. Archie Howard had heard of Flack's experience and borrowed a .32 revolver from my grandfather. Not long afterwards, my grandfather ran onto Creighton, and he said, "I hear the government's going to try and build a building up here again. Can you loan me a gun?" And he said, "All I want is something to make a big bang and a big puff of smoke." And my grandfather had a black powder gun that fit the bill. So he actually loaned guns to both sides. And I think there was more money in gun running than there was in ranching. But at any rate, Creighton soon brought the gun back and said it worked. And this being Canada, not Texas, my grandfather got both his guns back and nobody got hurt. But they didn't build until after Creighton died. In 1914, the government of Canada was buying horses for the army, and Creighton had hired Clem Edge and George Gordon to break horses along with Boney Thompson, who was sort of the foreman at the ranch. When they had a bunch ready to go, Creighton contacted Colonel Fry of the army to come to Cochrane and select the horses. So they trailed into Cochrane the broke horses that they had at the time, which was quite a number, and presented them to the army. And actually my grandfather was asked to ride quite a few of them, or perhaps all of them, and he said, "If you can walk and trot this way around the corral and walk and trot that way around the corral and stop and back up, they'll buy it." So they did. the officer in the army bought all the horses, and then my grandfather was there when they went to settle up, and Colonel Fry said, well, okay, what am I going to owe you? And Creighton said, I'm too old to fight, and I had no sons. This is my contribution to the war effort. And Creighton was also known for every year donating money to all three of the churches that were in Cochrane at the time. So this guy that ran the government off at gunpoint was a very generous man in many other respects. In March of 1915, George Creighton of the Barcy died, leaving the ranch to his brother Tom in eastern Canada. Now, Tom Creighton and his son Ernie came west to take over the ranch. But Tom Creighton knew very little about ranch life or even riding horses. So they gave him a very quiet driving horse that they thought would keep him out of trouble. And the old man put one spur on one boot, and that's what he rode with. And whenever the horse wouldn't go where he wanted him to, he'd hold out his foot and say, do what I want or I'm going to hurt you. In actual fact, he wouldn't hurt a fly. Ed Thompson went to Idaho to visit his brother, and Laurie was left in charge of the ranch, Laurie being Laurie Johnson, my grandfather. Creighton owned just the 1/4 section of the ranch, and Ernie bought the Miss Swearer's quarter up by the Ora Ranger Station. The Beaupre Creek Ranch was still part of the ranch at that time, and they gathered cattle or horses that were east of the Ghost and north and into there. The ranch was for sale. Just a year after, Tom Creighton bought it, and J.J. Bolin and P.D. Bolin both wanted it. They only wanted it for the horses. Horses were a very hot commodity at the time. And come on up here. We've got a seat for you if you wish it. Thank you. So P.D. Bolin got there first, and he and Laurie rode out through the horses, but they didn't happen to see many that day. And Bolin said, can you swear there are 500 horses here? And Laurie Johnson said, I can guarantee that there are. P.D. tossed a quarter, saying, heads I buy it, tails I don't, and it came up heads, so we bought the ranch. Laurie and Jack Fuller and Marshall Baffy began gathering the horses. P.D. brought Eddie Rowe up from Saskatchewan to help with the roundup. When they brought a bunch of horses in, the geldings, the saleable horses, were split off and sold, and the mares and foals were branded with a bar and then turned back out so they could keep track of the count. When they had finished, they had gathered 650 head of horses, for which, and Bolin had paid $40,000 for the ranch, or made $40,000 on the deal. And the Bolins were living on the ranch at the time. And as they finished the gather, Laurie said, P.D. Bolin was making a list of supplies to bring out from town. And my grandfather said, you better put 2 bicycles on that list. And Mr. Bolin said, well, why? And Laurie said, because you've sold all the saddle horses, there's nothing else to ride. He left the employ at that time. And on at least 3 occasions, the Barcy was threatened by major wildfire. In the teens, this is in the teen years. Years 15 and 16 was very wet. And in fact, the rivers got so high that times they couldn't get off the ranch because they couldn't ford the rivers with horses. But in the year 1914, a fire started by lightning up Beaupre. So first of all, 1910, there was a major fire, came from the south and jumped the Ghost River and burnt near the buildings, but not the buildings. In 1914, another fire started by lightning up Wapers Creek. It burned west of Black Rock and then south as far as the Barcy Hay Meadows. And in 1919, a fire started in the Broken Lake area and jumped the Ghost River, where it was a quarter of a mile wide. At least the gravel flats were. But they never did lose the buildings. The fires always managed to miss the buildings. In 1924, P.D. Boland sold the ranch to Mr. Duncan and his sons Cecil and Jack. In 1935, they sold to Mrs. Merriman and her daughter. I believe granddaughter Jenna married Bob McDougall. The ranch has changed hands several times to others, including Bill Cox, Horst Wersig, Lester Beck, and others. And I am sorry, the current owner, his first name is Dwayne, and I don't remember his last name. Philip could tell us the last name, but they're the current owners of the Barcy. So that's what I could drag up on the Barcy.
Well, thank you. I had one little story that I'd heard years ago after P.D. Boland bought the Barcy, and they were gathering up the horses. There was a fellow who, I think he originally came from Saskatchewan, but he lived most of his life later in Cochrane, by the name of Eddie Rowe. And Eddie Rowe was one of the guys helping to gather the horses. And at the time, there happened to be a lady staying at the ranch that was a nurse. So one morning, they're getting ready to go gather horses, and Eddie gets mounted up on his horse. And before he gets out of the corral, this horse decides to buck a little bit. And he bounced Eddie up and down in the saddle 3 or 4 times, and then he bounced him once on the saddle horn and then onto the ground. Well, Eddie's laying out there in the ground kind of out of wind and hurting a little bit. And this nurse thought this was a good time to put into practice all the knowledge she'd learned in nurses' school. So she goes running out into the crowd and she says, "Oh, Mr. Rowe, are you all right? Are you all right?" Well, Eddie couldn't say much. He was still trying to get his breath and rolling around on the ground, and she bombarded him with a few more questions. And finally she said, "Mr. Rowe, are you hurt? Where are you hurt, Mr. Rowe?" But this time Eddie's got a little of his wind back, and he looks up at her and he says, "Ma'am, if you'd got hurt where I got hurt, you wouldn't have been hurt at all." But a little more about my family's history. Like I said, my father had the sawmill, or my grandfather had the sawmill. He had 7 children at the time, or over the years. And besides running the sawmill, he also had a little store that he ran there at Morley, or the mill. And he was a wheelwright and used to fix wagons, did blacksmith work and that. And he also supplied, I have here in my collection somewhere, a statement, because he supplied the materials and built a dipping vat in what is now was known as the Desjardins Field. That's where the Good Stony Rodeo Center stands. It's always known as the Desjardins Field. And he built the dipping vat, and this is a statement from 1919. And besides the cost of building the vat, it's all the names of all the people and the number of cattle that they dipped there. And there's names on there like Alex Jameson, Rush Feltz, Dave McDougall, McDonald's, and Nobles, and quite a P.D. Boland dipped one head, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of a list of what he had. And he also, like I said, he ran a store, and just for the heck of it, I dug this out of my collection. Actually, these are copies because I had some of my grandfather's stuff, and I put it in the archives at Glenbow. And these are just kind of copies. when he ran the store, and this is a list of stuff he bought from LT Beaupre and Company Wholesale Grocers on January 15th, 1918. You could have bought 50 pounds of roasted peanuts for $9. And one cad of tobacco, which weighed 84 pounds, by the way, for a cad, cost $14.70. And a 19 or a 17 pound pail of candy was worth $3.23. So I think groceries are a little more expensive these days. But that's just, some of the things that he did and ran the store. And after they closed the mill, my Uncle Ed bought what was known as Andrew Sybil Place on Jameson Road. And I believe he was 3/4 there plus the school section. And my grandpa and my Uncle Ed's brothers, they all moved there for a while and lived there together, and they were known as the Playboys of Poverty Bend. And at that time, I believe Erik's grandmother and grandfather were living on what's called the Laycock Place, which is where Ad Rich is now. And one time, I guess there was kind of a party at the Poverty Bend house, and there was a lady involved, and she got sick. And Uncle Audley thought she had pleurisy, so he rode over to the Laycock Place to get Erik's grandmother to come over and see what they could do about it. So she rode over there, and then in those days they thought the cure for everything was a mustard plaster. So they made up a mustard plaster, and as Erik's grandmother said, it's a wonder she didn't, they put it in a flour sack. They said it's a wonder she didn't have the emblem of Robin Hood emblazoned on her chest. Apparently she fought quite a bit, but they got this mustard plaster on her. And then they decided, well, maybe they should take her temperature. Well, all they had for a thermometer was one of those dairy thermometers. Now, for those of you who are maybe not sure what a dairy thermometer is, it's a glass tube about that long, about as big as my thumb. And you used to, when you wanted to pasteurize your own milk or whatever you want to do with the milk, you hung that, put the pail on the stove, and you put this thermometer in it. And when it got to the right temperature, well, it's what you had. So they didn't want to put it in her mouth because she might bite it. It was glass. So they decided to stick it under her armpit. So they put it under her armpit for a while, and Jean's holding her down with the mustard plaster on her, and Uncle Audley's got her arm clamped down on this thermometer. And after a while, Jean looks at Uncle Audley and says, "What's her temperature?" Uncle Audley bends over and he looks at this thermometer and he said, "She's up to cheese." Well, because of the expert medical care she received, or maybe because of, in spite of it, she survived and went back to town. But I never did know if she ever came back to accept any more hospitality from the Playboys of Poverty Bend. And that's, and of course, being raised there on the ranch as a kid, not going to school, and we didn't have many neighbors. And like I said, because of the river and the bridge, there was only 3 families of us on the south side that lived there. So as kids, my sister and I kind of had to make our own amusement, so to speak. And I wrote a little poem about an incident that happened to my sister. Just give me a moment and I'll scratch through my papers here somewhere. There we are. And I entitled this poem, "My Sister, the Cow Twister." When my sister and I were young, as country kids are apt to do, we sometimes did some things that might seem strange to you. Now, this incident, it happens when Wendy's maybe 10. Our folks milked some cows and shipped the cream back then. Well, these old cows that we owned were mostly family pets. They were about as quiet as a cow can get. Well, when Wendy and I went to get the cows, we didn't think it a sin to hop on one bareback and chase the others in. Now, old Loopy was Wendy's favorite. They got along just fine. Riding her sure beat walking to gather cows at milking time. Now, we had an older cousin, Victor, who had drifted out from town, and he was going to spend summer helping Mom and Dad around. One evening, Wendy gets to telling Victor how she has this cow broke to ride. He don't quite believe her, but Wendy tells him, just step aside. You just hide and watch while Loopy and I make some tracks. She puts her saddle on her back and on the cow and steps across her back. Now, being rode bareback was nothing new, but the saddle, it felt mighty strange. Loopy coughs out her cud and begins to beller and starts looking for a higher range. The first jump this old cow makes, man, was she airborne. Wendy sort of folded up and kissed the saddle horn. The second jump that she takes, my sister sails away and bites the dirt. She loses all her wind, splits her lip, gets a green cow stuff on her shirt. Well, even after all these years, I still wonder now who bellered the loudest, my sister or that cow. Thank you. Yeah, what country kids will do to amuse themselves. But I know reading that poem kind of reminded me that my mom and dad got married in 1937. And for several years, they worked for Fred Brewster in Jasper and various other outfitters for working. And then in 1943, my sister was born. So they decided that, guess they'd kind of have to stay home. So in order to make a little money, they thought they'd take up milking cows and shipping the cream, which most people did, and get a little money from the cream check. So my mother decided she needed a cream separator. And when her and Dad had got married, Guy Gibson had gave my mother a mare and a colt. Well, by 1944, this mare had 4 colts. So my mother sold the mare and 4 colts and put $2 with it to buy a $39.80 cream separator. And for years, we milked a few cows and shipped the cream in the summertime. And between that and family allowance checks, I guess we got by. And in later years, when we started getting a few more cows, we couldn't raise enough feed for our own cows, so we hayed on shares down at Morley for years. And glad to see JR and Pauline here. JR worked for my dad, I don't know how many summers in the hayfield. And my dad always said he was the best hired man he ever had because he never wanted any money till the haying was done. So, I don't know, you got any other stories, Eric, while I think up some more BS?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. It was great interest hearing Doug's stories about his family and whatnot when my grandfather homesteaded in 1936, and my mother and her sister were school age and needed to be taught, and it was cheaper and more efficient for them to build a log cabin on the ranch and hire a school teacher than it was to send them to Cochrane. And Doug's mother was that school teacher. So my grandfather's family, my great-grandfather, came to Cochrane in 1910. He had actually been born in Virginia and worked his way across the American West. He was in Deadwood, South Dakota for a period of time where he knew Wyatt Earp, who was the sheriff there at the time, and he rode shotgun on a stagecoach. And then he worked on further west to the Powder River country in Wyoming and worked on a ranch with 2 other guys. One was called Leroy Parker and the other was called Harry Longbaugh. Those 2 fellows became better known later as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. when my grandfather, the ranch sent him up to southern Alberta at the time, the Northwest Territories, looking for pasture because they'd run out of grass in Wyoming. And he liked what he saw, and he liked what he saw for three reasons. When he came up here in about 1886, the area that we would now think of as sort of High River, Grantham, Pakisco, Nanton, and that country was a sea of grass. That was the one reason that he really liked the country. The second reason was because the Northwest Mounted Police were here and had established law and order, which didn't exist much in much of the western U.S. at the time. And the third reason was the federal government issued 20-year leases. And if you had one of those leases on up to 100,000 acres, you were the sole person that could graze on it. And the reason they had to leave Wyoming was because there was no herd law. You just turned them out and grazed them wherever you wanted, and ultimately overgrazed and ran out of pasture. So he came up in 1889 with 8,500 head of cattle and established the ranch in the Bayou area and around there. He got married while he was at the Bayou, and his friend Harry Longbaugh, Sundance Kid, was the best man. He'd been in Alberta just for about a year before he went back to the States and took up another profession, something to do with trains, I think. So when he moved his family to Cochrane in 1910 and started a butcher shop. And shortly after that, there was a bad guy got loose in Calgary and was reported to have murdered somebody, and the rumor was he was heading west. And of course, after Bowness, Cochrane was the first town on the railway track. And the town had hired what they called a town man, and he was sort of a bylaw officer and sort of a handyman. Cochrane wasn't all that big in those days. And this guy was not a trained policeman by any means. But he, heard the rumor everyone else did that this escaped murderer was heading for his town. So he didn't know what to do. He was quite panicky. So he hunted up my great-grandfather, who he had heard by reputation that he'd been in Deadwood, South Dakota, and he knew the Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy and all the rest of it, and rode shotgun on a stagecoach. So he hunted up my grandfather, or great-grandfather, who was out in the back barn, and most of the houses in town in those days had a barn, and they ran their milk cows up on the big hill. And my great-grandfather was milking his cow. And this guy came in just panic-stricken. What was he going to do? He didn't hire on for this. His murder was coming his way, and he wasn't prepared to deal with it, and he was quite panicky. And so my great-grandfather spent the time it takes to milk a cow calming the guy down. And he said, you got to understand, he's probably not even coming into this town. Why would he come to the first town on the railway? If he'd be going the other way, or if he was coming west at all, he would skirt the town. So over the course of the 10 or 15 minutes, he calmed the guy down, and the guy went down. It was after dark by this time, and he was going down the back alley carrying his coal lantern. And Dad Johnson decided that this was rather unbecoming of a police officer to be so steamed up about what Dad Johnson's opinion was a non-event. So the guy's about 3 doors down the back alley, and Dad Johnson took his rifle out from behind the barn door and shot the glass out of the lantern. They had to get a new cop. And then in the Depression, my grandmother first homesteaded north of the Rabbit Lake Reserve, and proved up her homestead there in the early to mid 30s, 33, 34, 35, I think it was. My grandfather got a job, a make work project, helping to build the Banff-Jasper Highway with horses. And he said he got the job because his horses were conservatives. And he got $1 a day for the team and $1 a day for himself, and the room and board for the 3 of them. And in 1936, the federal government, the conservative federal government, R.B. Bennett, fell in the election in Ottawa, and the Liberal government took over. And my grandfather said they fired all the conservative horses and hired all Liberal ones. So with that, my grandfather was out of work and decided to come down and homesteaded on southwest of 17, which my brother has now and is still in the family. So.
Seeing as you mentioned R.B. Bennett, and that's when he got to be Prime Minister of Canada, that's when we got the Bennett buggy. Because you couldn't afford gas or to fix them, so put a tongue on the front end and hooked the horses to it. And I can remember the joke my parents used to tell me about R.B. Bennett. He said when he got elected, if he got elected in 6 months, he was going to put Canada on its feet again. And they said he was right, because within 6 months, everybody was walking across Canada looking for work. But and some other little incidences I remember, well, I have, just for the heck of it, I was going through some stuff, my stuff I had here the other day, and I happened to find the marriage certificate for my grandparents. And they were married in county of Dalhousie in Ontario on May 26th, 1897. And I thought it kind of interesting because on May 25th, 1977, there was another James Richards born in this area. So, kind of a coincidence, I guess. But I know as a young fella growing up, I didn't have a heck of a lot to do, and we rode a lot of horses, rode colts. And I remember one year when I guess I was about 14, maybe 15, and the big event in the country at that time was the Morley Stampede on the 1st of July. So we always went down to that. Well, I had this bright idea that maybe I was going to enter the bronc riding, and I knew you had to be there before noon to get entered. Well, my parents didn't want to get there till before 1 o'clock or so when it was going to start. And so I didn't think I'd get there in time, so I went up to the barn and I got my saddle horse and I took Dad's saddle. He had an association saddle that he bought in Riley McCormick's in 1932. And it was more like a bronc saddle than anything I had. So saddled the horse up and I rode down to the rodeo at Morley. And when I got there, I think we were a little more honest in those days. I rode over to the gate to pay my admission to get in. And there was a big cardboard sign on the gate there, and I'll always remember this. And the cardboard sign said admission, adults $1. Children 50 cents, kids under 12 free, and at the bottom, Indians $1 a carload. Well, I did enter the bronc riding, and I don't know, I made about 3 or 4 jumps, because that was back in the days I didn't realize that rocks, thistles, and gopher holes weren't part of a rodeo grounds. And I made about 4 jumps and got my head stuck in a gopher hole, but I was okay. I don't know about the gopher. But that's kind of what we did for amusement. And I guess I was very fortunate because in about 1955, Shorty Hensman, who lived over on the old Morrison place, which is over on Grand Valley, now owned by Simpsons, to be the first place. If you're going up Grand Valley, it'd be the first place on your left-hand side. He decided to start a 4-H club. So we got involved in that, and the roads were getting a little better. Of course, we only had meetings once a month, so that was our one time to get out and kind of socialize. And we, with your 4-H calves and public speaking. And at those times, the 4-H show wasn't until the middle of August in Calgary. So, I mean, having a 4-H calf was kind of like milking a bunch of cows. You were tied down 24/7. So that was kind of a big thing in our lives, being being on the club, and I think it folded in about 1960. But for some reason, they decided that maybe I should be the treasurer one year. So at the end of the year, we used to take the books into the Royal Bank in Cochrane, and Harry Wood was the manager then, bank manager. And he'd audit them and give them back. Well, I took the books in, and when I went to get them back, he called me into his office. And he complimented me on what a good job I'd did on these books. And he looked at me and he said, when you get finished your grade 12, he said, you come see me, I'll give you a job anytime you want. Well, I hated to tell the poor old gentleman that I'd crawled out of the cradle with my mind made up I was going to live or die by the horse. And I've come pretty close time or two. So I didn't pursue my career as an accountant or a teller, and it kind of reminds me, I know, I guess when I was working for Dalton Gibson, we went down, we used to get our mail at Morley at that time at the store down there, and I remember going in there and I was about 16. There was a big poster on the wall. And the parks were looking for park wardens. So I got looking at that and I thought, you know, that interests me. And I got reading the qualifications, and you have to be 18 and have grade 10. Nothing said about 2 languages. So I looked and I thought, you know, I'm 16. If I take half a grade 10 this winter and half a grade 10 next winter when I'm working in the sawmill, by the time I'm 18, I'll have my grade 10 and I can go see if I can get a job as a park warden. So the first winter I did half the lessons of grade 10, and for some reason I passed them. Well, the next year I maybe wasn't quite as industrious. So when the mill kind of shut down spring breakup, I had gone home. And I still had some of these lessons to do. I think there was maybe 30 lessons in a course. And I had probably about 4 courses, and I had 2 or 3 lessons left in each one. So I decided that I'd finish this. So I was at home, and it was one of those beautiful spring days. It was getting on into May by this time. And Mom and Dad were outside doing something, and I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to do these lessons. And I wasn't having any luck. You could smell the world coming alive, the earth coming alive, and you could hear the robins singing, and I just couldn't concentrate on these lessons. So finally I decided, you know, I'll put them up on the shelf here. And I had a couple horses up at the corral that I was riding, and I thought, I'll go up and go for a ride. I'll get back to these lessons tonight. So I put them up on the shelf. I never opened them again. And I think on that day, people talk about retirement. Well, I think on that day when I put those lessons on the shelf and went and saddled a horse, I started down a trail that led me through a lifetime of retirement.
Well, this is fabulous. I'm just going to suggest that we have a coffee break now. There's a couple of windows open there, and you can get coffee, cookies, tea, there's water. Enjoy. We'll resume in a bit. Okay, thank you, everybody. I think we're ready to roll again here. And I think we'll have Doug start one more time.
Thank you. Well, I thought I might touch a little bit more on some of a little bit more of my family history. My Uncle Bill, he homesteaded. Dad, oddly, and Uncle Bill homesteaded 3 quarters, all in kind of right in the same area where I live now. And Uncle Bill joined the army and went to war. And when he was overseas, he met a lady in Belgium, Aunt Mary. She turned out to be my Aunt Mariette in later years, and they got married. Well, she came to Canada, and she always remembers, because she said she came to Canada on the day I was born. And she must have came across in the boat and took the train from down east and came to Morley, and she didn't speak any English. And Dad and Uncle Bill went down to meet her, And walking buffalo, or George McLean, Uncle Bill knew him quite well. So he taught George McLean how to say, "Welcome to Canada, Mrs. Richards," in Flemish, because Aunt Mariette didn't speak French, she spoke Flemish. So she gets off the train, doesn't know anybody. George goes up to her and welcomes her to Canada in her own language, and she was ecstatic. She didn't realize that the native people over here spoke her language. And she starts talking to George a mile a minute, and he's standing there, doesn't have a clue what she's saying. And they lived on the homestead next to us for a little bit, and then they bought a section off my grandfather, and the section is the one that's directly east. It's section 19, directly east of where Rich lives. And I know after my grandfather died, he left all his personal belongings to my Uncle Audley. And Dad was helping Uncle Audley clean this out, and my grandfather had a little sod shack in the bush there to the south, and it was pack ratism, I guess, runs in the family, because there was about anything you could imagine. Stuff left over from the store, and Roger syrup cans full of different types of porridge and whatever else you could put in them. And also, I know under the tree, there was the remains of a 1917 Model T Ford. So Dad asked Uncle Audley, "What are you going to do with that car?" Uncle Audley said, "Let the boy have it." He said, "I don't want it." So we loaded it up and took it home. And I've never done anything with it, but it's still in the back of the shop. And quite a few years later, I was going through, because Uncle Audley stored some of his stuff in my Uncle Bill's cabin. It was still in the place. I was going through some papers and that's where I got some of these. And I found the original bill of sale for that 1917 Ford. And he bought it off my great uncle, who happened to own the Ford dealership in Big Valley. And with the freight to Calgary, a set of chains, spare set of headlights, and a couple other little things, the total cost was $522 and change. One of these days, if I get rich and famous, I might have it restored. But speaking kind of log cabins and dugouts and that, when McDougall's used to run a lot of cattle in the area, and of course there wasn't many people around, so not all the land was, they leased. You just used it. It was there to use. And up at Meadow Creek, where Brewster's winter horse camp is now, they used to winter their calves up there. And George Creighton got it when he bought the Barcy. He also leased a bunch of land from the forestry, so he acquired that area as a lease. And I don't know if there's anything still left there or not, but because it's been over 50 years since I went and last looked, but not too far from where the cabin stands now, there was a dugout in the side of the hill, and I was told that that's where McDougall's hired men when they used to. That was their winter cow camp, and when they were keeping an eye on the cattle, that's where they lived. Whether there's anything left of it or not, I don't know, but just a little more piece of the history of that part of the country. And now what else was I going to say? You might imagine me running out of things to say. Oh, I know what I was going to do, because it brought it to mind here, and I found something else that my father had in a bit of a collection. No, can't find the right one. But anyway, it kind of brought it to mind because I was talking with a gentleman here earlier, and we were talking about the forest fires and stuff like that. And all the people going into the forestry, and I'd like to read what's on the back of this little piece of paper. It says, "Conditions to be observed by the permittee. Any land use should be kept in a clean and sanitary condition. Refuge and waste being burned or buried, and the ground kept free from inflammable material. Refuse and waste shall not be placed in streams or lakes. Any campfires or smudges started by the permittee must be completely extinguished before being left. Such fires must not be started near any resinous or moss-laden trees or other highly inflammable material. And the site must be cleared of vegetable matter down to the mineral soil for a distance of 4 feet from the fire. The permittee will be held responsible for any fire starting directly or indirectly from his use of the reserve, and his services shall be given free in fighting any such fire. No timber shall be cut under this permit except that required for a campfire, tent poles, or other legitimate camping purposes. Such timber shall be cut from dead or damaged timber whenever such is available. Blazing, peeling, lopping, or otherwise damaging timber or young growth is prohibited. This permit is not transferable and must be shown on the request of a forest officer. Failure to observe any of the foregoing conditions will render the permit subject to cancellation and the permittee liable to the penalties provided for the infraction of the provincial forest reserves regulations. And that's written on the back of this permit, which is free. It's a free permit, and it was issued to my father, James Richards, in the Crow Bow River Forest Reserve. And it's for a party of 2, and it was to travel to the North Fork River. And in the Ora Ranger District. And it was issued November 15th to November 30th, 1937. And that's where my mom and dad went on their honeymoon. They went moose hunting, and that's the permit. Yeah. Good old days. And speaking of hunting, like when I was a kid, to make any money, we used to hunt a few squirrels. And I came across this too when I was looking through my dad's stuff there. And in 1960, I sold from J.E. Love and Sons Limited Feed and Supplies in Calgary, 27 squirrels at 40 cents, 33 squirrels at 35 cents, 27 squirrels for 25 cents, 3 weasels at 50 cents apiece, for a total of $36.60, and that represented pretty well a winter's work. So, but that's kind of how you got your spending money. And back in those days, the squirrels weren't as many as they were now, because the residents at Morley used to hunt them too, because that was about the only spending money we had. And there were quite a few days when you might not even get one. They were that scarce. I remember my dad telling me one time that after him and Mom were married and they were living at home, he'd get up in the morning real early and he'd saddle his horse and he'd ride all the way up to Black Rock and get there about daylight to hunt squirrels and then ride home again at night, because there wasn't very many left in our part of the country to make a few dollars to pay the bills. And also at one time, I think it was, I'm not sure of the year, 1906, 1907, somewhere back there at that time of the year, they started a gold rush on the Ghost River, right about where the bridge is, and they claimed there was over 500 claims staked on that river, but they never found any gold. And the next gold rush was on the fallen timber, which I believe might have took place in the Depression years. And the story I got, it was started by a fellow from Morley because he had a little string of horses and he made the only gold made was what he got for packing the gold miners into the fallen timber. And I remember my dad telling me that at that time, him, Arul, and Don Dawson, and Jack Harris were all living together at Dawson's place. They had a little shack beside the road there. And Dad said by the time fall came, all the prospective prospectors and gold seekers had all left the fallen timber. He said there was only one fellow left up there. And he was a Swiss guy. And he was bound determined there was gold there and he was going to find it. And Dad said one day they looked out the shack window and he was walking down the road to Morley, and Dad said it was cold. And he had a light coat on, no hat, no gloves. And he was waving his arms in the air and talking to himself and headed for Morley. And Dad said we never saw him again. And that was the end of the fallen timber gold rush, I guess. But it's kind of off the subject here, but Erik and I had a contest going here one time. And, well, I'm a big fan of pie. And I don't know, it doesn't seem like I could ever get enough. And then finally the light bulb come on one day and I thought, why don't I just learn how to make my own? So I started making a few pies, and Erik, he started, and this poem was a result of it. The days were short and the weather cold, so I didn't see any reason why I shouldn't stay inside the house and build myself a pie. My first attempt wasn't all that bad, and I know one thing is true. I've eaten a whole lot worse and paid for the privilege too. Now, I might not have bragged so much if I'd known how things would end, but then how was I to know this was the beginning of a trend? My neighbor Erik phoned one day, complaining about the snow and winter weather. He was short of feed, cattle prices were low, and his pie dough wouldn't stick together. When I tried a piece of his apple pie, I didn't want to admit it at the time, but I had to face up to the truth. His was a lot better than mine. His crust was so tender and flaky as well, and with the first bite I knew right then I'd have to take my wounded pride and go back to the practice pan. Well, the challenge was issued and the gauntlet flung. Cows went unfed and chores undone. With a little practice soon we could make pies like our mothers tried to make. We made all different kinds of each new success we'd boast, and flour dust hung like smoke along the valley of the ghost. As the contest raged, other ranchers became involved, and it wasn't long until a new society had evolved. The women now do all the chores. Somehow it sure seems strange to see these tough old ranchers working on a different kind of range. We're now inside where it's warm and dry and the winter weather holds no fear as we walk around the house with a phone hanging from our ear. And now you should hear these women as they complain and twitch because they're outside and suffering from the woolen underwear itch. Now at the local functions, the women gather by the bar, discussing agricultural matters, the high price of veterinary fees, while us men sit quietly at a corner table, sipping ginger ale and exchanging recipes. And being kind of out of some stories that I could tell, or maybe don't want to embarrass some people that are still alive to that, I wrote another poem here way back when. And when I was a young guy and working for example, I worked for Helen McDonald up here on the Mount Royal Ranch. And I got my room and board, $125 a month, and every second Sunday off when the chores were done. And so, of course, not having that kind of money, much money, and I didn't work for much better wages when I got older. And come to think of it, when I see Dennis and Judy Flunder sitting back here, I can remember when Dennis's dad was one of the waiters, beer slingers in the old Cochrane Hotel. And of course, you have to be 21 to get in those days. Well, Pete knew every kid in the country and he knew their age. But Pete didn't work on Thursdays. So, about the time I didn't have a lot of money, there was some product on the market. There was a Applejack and there was Cherry Jack, but they also had another kind called a double jack. And it was right up our price range. It was 95 cents a quart, or $2.50 a gallon. And I wrote a little poem about it entitled The Ode to Double Jack. This other fellow and me drew the short straws, you see, and we were left to hold down the shack. There was no one else, just him and myself, and a gallon of old double jack. Well, with nothing to do, we got into this brew like a pair of thirsty pigs. After a while, my partner did smile and says, "What say we blow these digs? Everyone will be in town, so let's ride on down." And he makes a dash for his hat. "Stock is all right. We can ride back tonight. Let's go where the action is at." Well, we had quite a glow, so I said, "Let's go." Besides, the gallon was finished. Chock full to the eyes, we're feeling real wise, but our thirst was far from diminished. We dashed through the door with a whoop and a roar. We gonna have fun. Place was plumb full, and this is no bull. Seems we knew everyone. At a table with the boss sat a one-eyed hoss and a cowboy with a hole in his boot, a big old leghorn, somebody shorthorn, and a bull with a ring in his snoot. Now Johnny was there with his snuff-chewing bear, and there was a gopher drinking gin fizz, a girl with a tattoo, and a hippie or two. Oh, what a party this is. Well, at the end of the bar, a guy with a guitar was lustily singing about. Girl's one shoe, she only had one leg too. About then, I think I passed out. Well, when I come to, I was covered with dew and cold as a dead rattlesnake. Terrible taste of my tongue, I thought I'd been hung, and with each breath I'd shiver and shake. My stomach was ill, I was green in the gill. My skull had a terrible throb. Pain in my back and my legs wouldn't track. How'd I get Billy down on this log? Well, if I don't die, I'll quit drinking, says I, or at least until I heal up. I don't hear any noise. Where's the rest of the boys? Oh, I'm sicker than 2 poisoned pups. I can't find my hat. Where is it I'm at? Damn that old double jack. I focused my eyes, and to my surprise, I hadn't got 50 feet from the shack.
Well, thank you, Doug. He talked about the pie making, and he's somebody I've looked up to all my life. He's quite a bit older than I am, and I often phone him for advice on making pies. And actually, one time we decided to enter the Bear's Paw Fair in the pie making contest. So we did. We didn't know at the time there was a few ringers in that contest, and I come last and Doug comes second last. But undeterred, we entered again the following year, and Doug come last, and they disqualified me. And I said, "What do you have to do to get disqualified in a pie making contest?" And the fair used to always be the end of August, and I'd made a peach pie, and the judge said if you have a peach pie, you have to have a sugar crust, which I didn't have, hence the disqualification. So I've kind of boycotted them ever since. But Doug was on his way down to Elko, Nevada to perform at the big event down there, the cowboy poetry thing, and I couldn't go that year, so I made a rhubarb pie and took it up to him. And about a week later, I got a postcard in the mail. And that's in the days when he was driving that big white Lincoln that he bought. He said, "When I first bought this car, it didn't make much sense, but it sure is fun to travel in opulent decadence. I'll cherish this memory till the day I die, cruising down I-15 eating rhubarb pie." So, I've still got that tucked away somewhere. But I would like to talk now. We're so fortunate tonight to have some of our Stony neighbors and friends here with us. We've got Pauline and Jay, our 2 young men. We've got Charlie Rabbit. We've got Watson and his son, Junior Kukwitz. And please welcome these folks. They're wonderful people. And I'd like to talk about an old Stony that my grandparents knew well in the 30s and early 40s. His name was Jacob Swampy. And we hear that from my grandparents' information, he was born when his parents were on a hunting trip behind Black Rock Mountain. And they heard that's where he was born. My grandmother proved up her own homestead in the 30s, 33, 34, 35, and she stayed up there 90 days, 3 consecutive years to get the title on this homestead. And Jacob Swampy had a camp down south of Rabbit Lake, and he would ride up there lots of times. And if my grandmother had company, or sometimes her sister was there or a friend or something, she would make Jacob Swampy a cup of tea and a sandwich, and he would get off his horse and sit on a log and eat the snack. If she was alone up there, it was not proper to get off in a woman's camp, so he stayed on his horse. And my grandmother made the tea and the sandwich and passed it up to him, and he'd drink the tea and eat the sandwich still in the saddle. Subsequent to that, my grandfather homestead in 1936, down where my brother has property now, and Swampy still would come by, and my grandmother would still give him a cup of tea and a sandwich, and he often stopped by. And one time he borrowed whenever he came in the yard, he'd give this owl call. He'd hoot like an owl, and that announced his presence, and then he didn't knock. He'd just come in and sit down at the kitchen table and have a visit and maybe have a snack. So that was fine. Everybody was used to that. And one time he borrowed a knife in a sheath from my grandparents. And whenever Swampy borrowed something, they always got it back. But this knife didn't come back. And she asked him one time, we need our knife. Can you bring us our knife? And he just sort of got a little bristly, and he said, I do not have your knife. So they left it at that. But Swampy was getting on in years, and his eyesight was failing. And one night in the middle of the night, my grandmother woke up and said, wake up, Laurie, I hear Swampy's owl call. So they went outside the west side of the house, looking west across Robinson Creek, and sure enough, they could hear Swampy's owl call. So my grandfather walked down towards the creek through the willows and called him by name and told him to stay put, and he would come and get him. But Swampy didn't hear that part of it, and he turned towards my grandfather's voice and fell in the creek. So they fished him out of the creek, and they got him up in the house, and they got the stove going, and she made hot milk and brandy, and they got the old boy sort of straightened out and on his way again. But he didn't live much longer than that. And my grandparents would get messages from Morley about how he was doing, and he was failing, and he passed away. And 6 years later, my grandmother sort of sat up. That was Swampy's owl call. My grandfather said, don't be silly. He died 6 years ago. But she was quite upset by that. The next morning, she went out to get kindling from the woodpile, and there was the knife and sheath laying on the track, on the trail to the woodpile, in perfect condition. It wasn't rusted or dirty or anything, and there it was 6 years later. So that became, at least for some of us, the legend of the ghost of Jacob Swampy. Now, fast forward from that time, which would have been about the early 1940s, to the later 1980s, Spray Lake Sawmill were logging up northwest of the Stony Reserve and north of us, and they were hauling logs down across the reserve, right past where Swampy used to camp, and then through our place and out on the highway. So Keith Munford was working for us then, and he and I were feeding cows. So the loggers came down the road. They parked just before they turned onto the forestry road, the 940 highway, and checked their loads. And Keith and I come along, and here's this trucker whom I actually didn't know, but he was there, and he was really excited. He was just stomping around there and waving his arms. Do you know what's going on around here? I don't know what's going on around here. He says, up at mile 4, somebody in a buffalo coat and a big robe jumps out in front of the logging trucks. Up at mile 4 on the Indian Reserve. What's going on here? Well, I don't know what's going on there. But he was pretty steamed up. So later in the day, the truck boss came along, and he said, do you know what's going on? Who's scaring my drivers? And I said, yeah, I said, it's Jacob Swampy. And he said, well, where do I find him? I said, it's going to be a little hard. He died 46 years ago. It's his ghost. Well, the truck boss went away in a kind of a huff. But anyway, from time to time, different drivers up at mile 4 in the middle of the night shift would see somebody jumping out in the middle of the road and waving a rifle. No shots were ever fired, but it certainly rattled them. And on the night shift, they didn't have enough trucks to keep the loader guy busy all the time. There was about 20 minutes between each load that he had to wait for the next truck to come up. But this guy finds he's scared of ghosts. So he'd load the truck, then he'd get in with the driver and he'd ride down till he met the empty, and then he'd get in with the other driver and ride back up and load him. And this went on for a while, and then one day the ghost just didn't appear anymore. I wondered this year, is Sprayer hauling logs again very close to the reserve, but actually not on the reserve, and I haven't heard about the ghost showing up yet, but who knows, might be someday. And now, the other thing I wanted, and I talked to Watson this afternoon, and I got permission from him to read this letter. It's a fairly short letter. It's dated August 3rd, 1952. And it's from Joe Kakwitz, who was in the Colonel Belcher Hospital in serious health situation. Hello, Laurie and Mrs. Jean. I am just thinking of you in this lovely morning. By gosh, I am very sick, Laurie, at present time. I am down here at Calgary in the Colonel Belcher Hospital. So while I'm in the bed, my poor mind working around sometimes just like seeing my country Rabbit Lake. Also, you good fellows, which I used to like then. That's why I write this letter to you. I had an operation the other day, but doctor told me I'm going to have another operation pretty soon. So maybe I won't come back over there, but I hope so anyway. When I am thinking around and try who is my best friends, I remember that one of best friends of mine is Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. I just remember that I was going to tell you that I had little Joe Kakwitz. He is little over 2 months old. Nice boy. Now, if you are in town sometime, would you come and see me? How's the horses? Did you see them, Laurie? I think that will be all I can say. But I'll say that God will bless us all. So goodbye and good luck, Joe Kakwitz. Now, we have the good boy with us. We know him as Watson Kakwitz. And here he is. And Watson and his son, Junior, are going to play some instruments and do 2 or 3 songs for us. And so while he's setting up, I'll turn this back to Penny, and she has a few things to say, and then we'll benefit from Watson and Junior. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Well, I think you can all agree this has been a pretty amazing afternoon, and there's more to come yet. So I just wanted to take this moment to thank Doug and Eric very much for sharing their memories and stories, and really appreciate. And JR, 2 young men, you're welcome to come up as well.
Yeah, you'd like to come up and say a story or two you'd like to tell?
Thank you. Thank you for coming and listening to the stories of Duck and Duck. Hey, but however, I'm at a stage where age is catching up to me. As you can see, how I move around. No, my cousin, Wilfred Fox, when he was at my age, he told me, age is, being old is no good. Don't get old. He didn't told me how I can get not old. That's a question I feel to ask him. Well, anyway, it's nice getting to know each other again, seeing each other, and hearing some of these stories. You know, it takes me back to the days when I was probably young. Like what Doug said, I used to work for his dad and my uncle used to work for his dad's dad. So that's quite a long time ago, eh? But anyway, Doug and his family to us became part of our community. They have enjoyed our social get-together as community members. Doug's family, Jim, Mildred, Roll Dawson and his wife, and the other lady, I can't remember that family. They used to come and enjoy Christmas together at the old Wesley Hall. And during the evenings, there's always a powwow. There's always a social evening. And Doug's parents were very much part of that celebration. I know Doug talked about me helping Jim with the hay. No, I heard Jim. He used to be a good singer on that. He was a damn good singer. He would take part in the singing group. So that's how I refer Jim as part of the community. You know, we need people like him, especially today. We are fighting. We are fighting a system. We are fighting a system. And that fight we can refer to as reconciliation. Reconciliation is a big thing today in our modern world. You know, it's a system that we want to correct the past, the errors of the past, and convert that into something positive. Yeah, there's a lot of things getting back to getting to know each other, especially Doug. Our son Bernard and Doug, they treated each other as brothers. So that's how close we were. And we're still are close. In my early years, also worked for George Purnell. He was a farmer and rancher northeast of here. But I enjoyed working there too. You know, I met the neighbors around there. Well, you know, we are presently living in Cochrane and be part of the Cochrane community. We're Cochrane Nights for almost 4 years now. Thank you.
Thank you, JR. And while Watson and Junior are getting their music set up, I had one more poem I would like to do in respect to my neighbors. And I entitled this poem, The Old Dance Hall. And it was fitting that JR would mention it today. The night is cold, but still the place is full. There's people crowded along every wall. They're gathered for their New Year's powwow in the old Wesley Band dance hall. Outside I hear the crunch of horses' hooves, the squeal of sleigh runners on frozen snow. Drums softly beat, dancers bob and weave in the gas lamp's golden glow. Smells of wood smoke and of buckskin hang heavy throughout the air, and all eyes are upon the dancers as they perform an ancient ritual there. Quicker, louder the drum beats come as the singers' voices rise high and shrill, and dancers keep pace in their clothes decorated with feathers, beads, and quills. Along the walls, elders slowly weave as though caught up in a trance, while they watch their young men do the age-old chicken dance. Sounds of yesterday slowly disappear. I hear the roar of a pickup instead. Smells of wood smoke and buckskin fade away. The drums are all inside of my head. The old hall is rotting away. The roof's caved in. Log walls are beginning to crumble and fall. And the dancers I thought I saw become only shadows of long grass waving along the wall. The spell is broken. I turn to leave, then I tarry a bit even so. Not much remains except the memories from 40-odd years ago. Thank you.
Yes, please do.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored to, when I was invited, Jill, I was talking to Jill, and I was honored to come here and be part of this. And I just remembered some of that stuff. I remember growing up, I was born in Rabbit Lake. My mom and my dad came to check up on their horses, and I guess my mom was pregnant. She had to be pregnant, and and she got sick there, and so my dad drove back home, and she picked up a couple of ladies that they do that, and I was born out there, and I grew up there till I was 7 years old. We used to go back and forth to Morley and back to the old cabin up there. And so anyway, I just wanted to tell you, Doug was talking about shooting squirrels. Well, my Uncle Joe, I don't know if you know Uncle Joe Fox. Anyway, he was telling us that Jensen Francis was shooting squirrels around Rabbit Lake there. And Laurie Johnson was checking up on his calves, I guess. And he met him in the woods, and he got spooked, he got scared. because she seen a guy coming. And my mom told me when they take the pelt off the squirrel, they used to bite them on the hind leg and then they peel them off. Well, when Lori seen that guy coming, he seen a guy he thought was eating a squirrel raw. So he took off, and but I remember that, and I remember my mom used to tell me Doug's father they used to have dances, like fiddle dances out in Morley. And Doug's dad will come around, pick up Joe, my mom, and I don't know, but he used to have a wagon full and go across the river and go to a dance over there. And Doug would say, no, one time the fiddle player only knew, what song was it? Rubber Dolly. Played that all night, and that's what we danced to. So, yeah, and Eric here, ever since we knew each other, I've been, when elk bother him, just, hey, you used to call me up, and I used to come up, and he used to tell me, get them out of here, and I used to, like weekend hunt any time of the year. So we used to take one or two, and the rest will, and then the following week, they're back again. So anyway, yeah, these two are my good friends. So we're gonna play Rubber Dolly.